Of course, Israel is always pushing the United States to war with Iran. Uh, it's a very hot scene right now, and the U.S. Abided by Israel's requests just a few months ago. But the fact is that since 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu has led repeated governments in Israel explicitly calling for regime change in Iran. And he hasn't ended that call. He called for regime change in Iran again at the United Nations General Assembly debate just a couple of weeks past. So the United States, because it is so diligent in following Israel's dictates, could well be drawn into yet another war. With Netanyahu, there's never enough wars. Of course, I don't know their war planning. I don't follow and am not able to follow the daily military tactics and, as you say, placement of weapon systems and troops and intelligence gathering and other operations. But as a general principle, the 12-day war, so-called, did not solve the problems that Netanyahu claimed that it would. And so, no doubt, he would like to revisit that and engage once again in active kinetic regime change operations, whatever that might mean. Maybe more assassinations, maybe another outright war. Apparently, from all that we know, the attacks on Iran not only did not end Iran's potential of nuclear weapons, though they vociferously say they don't want nuclear weapons, but the enriched uranium is now in locations that are unknown and at sufficiently high enrichment that moving to nuclear weapons would not be an arduous task for the Iranians. So there are great uncertainties. Iran is under tremendous pressure, obviously. Also, incredibly, Iran gets attacked. The U.S. cheats on diplomacy, and it's the Europeans who say we need to reimpose sanctions on Iran. It's a kind of mind-boggling thing that it's just bullying rather than diplomacy, which is the main mode of operation. But that is a kind of green light as well for Netanyahu. He saw that he could make a unilateral attack on Iran in the context of U.S.-Iranian negotiations. Even then, during ongoing negotiations, Israel could unilaterally attack Iran, and not only would it not be blamed for doing so, the U.S. would join in, and Europe would apply its diplomatic pressure not on Israel but on Iran. It's a crazy world, but that's how it is.
Yeah, I was also a bit, well, shouldn't be surprised, but the Europeans didn't seem to have the same interest involved here. Uh, but so I didn't understand their actions to this extent because after the attack last time on Iran, as you said, they didn't condemn Israel. They, to a large extent, condemned Iran and its government. Even the media here seemed to do whatever it could to legitimize it. And now the EU3 or E3, I mean, UK, Germany, and France did these snapback sanctions, even though Iran was accommodating the IAEA, which seems to, well, only help to pave the way to legitimize another war. What is it with the Europeans here, though? Because this is, I mean, what is the deep interest in assisting the destruction of Israel? I know Chancellor BlackRock Mertz once made a point that Israel was doing the dirty work for us. I'm not sure if it was, well, in this big campaign in the Middle East, but what is the European interest in this?
Europe is dishonest in this all along. So we can say that this is not just a current mystery of why Europe doesn't observe the plain facts that it was Iran that was attacked. It was Iran that was trying to negotiate. It was Iran that let the IAEA back in, even after the IAEA clearly played along with Israel and the United States in the earlier round. Uh, we can go back a decade to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is a negotiated agreement of Iran with European countries and the United States. And uh, the idea of the JCPOA, of course, was a supervised and monitored agreement in which enrichment of uranium would be very limited. Iran would not have the means or the policy to pursue nuclear weapons. And on the counterpart side, the sanctions against Iran would be lifted. This was diplomacy. It worked. It reached an agreement. What happened? Of course, the United States reneged, as always. So the United States, under the pressure of the Israel lobby, reneged on the JCPOA. The Senate wouldn't support it, and especially when Trump came into office on January 20th, 2017, he basically ripped it up. What did the Europeans do? Essentially nothing. They wouldn't say one word about the United States ripping up the JCPOA. Then, as things went from bad to worse, the Europeans would never say, you know what, uh, government of the United States, you're leading us to a new confrontation. The Europeans are, the European leaders, excuse me, are pathetic. They are just vassals in the hands of the United States. Honestly, you don't hear any of them for, I think, at least 15 years saying a word about the U.S., no matter what the U.S. does. It's just amazing. And so it's not just a question, Glenn, of the last few weeks. It's a question in general. The Europeans have a strong interest in a stable, non-nuclear Iran and in diplomacy, but they fail to express that interest in any consistent way. And once again, I was in the UN Security Council just after the Israeli and US attacks on Iran. And I can tell you one by one, the European governments around the table of the UN Security Council blamed Iran for the attacks on Iran. They couldn't raise a word about Israel. They couldn't say anything about the truth. It was all that Iran must not escalate this crisis. That was the general idea. Uh, Iran is bombed. So what does the European ambassador say? Iran must not strike back. It's just bizarre. But this is basically European subservience to the United States and U.S. subservience to Israel. And it's put everything upside down. It doesn't work. It doesn't lead to safety. It doesn't lead to peace.
Yeah, that's what's missing across all aspects of security in Europe, I guess. There's no discussion of national interests anymore, national security, objectives, how these objectives can be realistically achieved. As you said,
Even, Glenn, I would say, even the basic facts day to day cannot be discussed honestly. And in the UN, again, in the session just after the attacks on Iran, the Europeans could not even bring themselves to have a straightforward, basic narration that Iran had been attacked by Israel and the United States. Well, if you can't even start with the most basic point, how can you reason to an outcome? You can't.
And also not just attack, but nuclear reactors. All of it is concealed under slogans, yeah, which are pretended to be values. It's very frustrating to watch. But in terms of the United States objectives, you argue that the U.S. always runs the errands of Israel, but I guess there's two different competing hypotheses. Well, they could both be true. That one of the objective of the U.S. is to restore empire. That is, the U.S. is quite hostile to the multipolar world, which has asserted itself. I guess is Iran would be an easy target as opposed to Russia or Iran. Sorry, Russia or China. Um, on the other hand, I don't disagree with you. I also watched Tucker Carlson reporting that in the first war, the IDF were just walking through offices in the Pentagon, dictating to them what they should be doing, and Netanyahu himself brags that he more or less tells America how to behave itself in the Middle East. So, what do you make of it in terms of the U.S. though? Is it one the other, or is it both empire and just doing whatever Israel tells them to?
I think that when it comes to this region of the Eastern Mediterranean and West Asia, it really is Israel policy. It is not U.S. Imperial policy or interest, because the U.S. could have a lot more influence. It could be doing a lot more constructive business. It could be finding a much greater advantage for the U.S. If it were not pursuing Israel's wars. And I subscribe to the view that Netanyahu has been the main cheerleader for all of these wars. The idea that Netanyahu espoused with his American political advisors back in 1996 called clean break, which is that Israel and the U.S. together should overthrow governments in the region that support the Palestinian cause, I think is the dominant view of Israel. It's Israel's obsession. And therefore, Netanyahu has called repeatedly for overthrow of governments in his neighborhood. That includes Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and he took credit for the overthrow of Assad at the UN just a few days ago. It has called for overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and Netanyahu was certainly the cheerleader of the Iraq War. We have that from lots of insiders as well as from Netanyahu's own very public testimony. Netanyahu was certainly the cheerleader for the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 at the hands of NATO bombers. That again was part of the Israel agenda. And overthrowing the Iranian regime is not even an open secret. It's just an open call, open declaration by Netanyahu, and Israel, and the United States has gone along with Israel. I actually think, maybe I'm naive, but I think it's true that when Trump came into office, he wanted to negotiate with Iran. I don't think that the 5 rounds of negotiations with the Iranians were pure subterfuge. I think that as the negotiations were proceeding, and proceeding constructively, Netanyahu's ire was and worry was going up. The one thing Netanyahu hates is diplomacy, diplomacy that could mean solutions other than U.S. and Israeli military force and dominance. And so my guess is, again, without knowing the archives or the inside view, that these were real negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, not simply trickery. When they were occurring, after each of the first 5 rounds, there were positive statements made that constructive progress was being made. And then the bombing came in advance of the 6th round. My guess is that it was the success of the diplomacy that prompted Netanyahu to act as Netanyahu did. And so, to answer your question, I think the best evidence is that this is a Israel-led policy, not U.S.-led imperial policy in this case.
Well, I can see why Israel would be concerned about diplomacy when, well, a lot of its position in the region seems to be dependent on perpetual war, mowing the grass. But there's also a collapse of diplomacy in the wider West, isn't there? Because I know we had a strong bias towards war for the past 30 years, but it does seem like something else is growing as well. I mean, not just this buildup of U.S. assets in the Middle East for a strike on Iran, but the military buildup, preparation for war against Venezuela. In Europe, we have now reports that the British are involved in the deep strikes in Russia. U.S. will also assist now with the intelligence for these strikes. Well, they've been already doing this in the past. I see in Georgia now that the president there warns that the West has been trying to pressure Georgia to join the proxy war, and now our NGOs are trying to topple the government to achieve this. And of course, you have occasional threats against China, bullying of India. This is it's escalating, though. I mean, our political elites, they don't seem to have any interest at all in diplomacy, and war seems to be always the only solution to all the mounting problems. I guess it's a very wide question, but how do you make sense of this, though? Because this is happening at a time when our ability to win the wars are declining. Uh,
Yes.
it's just, how do you explain this death of diplomacy?
So I think that we do have a larger context in which to understand this. First, the largest context is, of course, the United States is an imperial power, and it has been the world's leading imperial power since 1945, in essence. Britain was before World War II, really for the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, until the end of World War II. And then the two world wars ended the British Empire, in effect, largely bankrupted Britain, and the baton, as it were, passed to the United States. And the U.S. is an imperial power in the sense that it has deemed, going back to 1945, the right to choose who rules where, including by wars of choice and by overthrowing governments either overtly or covertly. A covert regime change operation, by the way, doesn't mean that it's hidden from view. That's very hard to do. It just means the U.S. denies what is obvious, that it played a role in overthrowing the government. For instance, denying the U.S. role in overthrowing the Ukrainian government in February 2014. Well, there have been dozens and dozens of U.S. regime change operations. There's a wonderful book by Lindsay O'Rourke, a professor at Boston College and a student of John Mearsheimer, a book called Covert Regime Change, which documents 64 covert regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 by the U.S. So this is a standard practice, and it has been a standard practice for 80 years. And before that, it was a standard practice from the 1890s onward, but in a much more restricted geographical zone. The U.S. Incessantly overthrew governments in Latin America in the first half of the 20th century. It also overthrew the Kingdom of Hawaii. It engaged in a war of choice with Spain in 1898 and so forth. That's a backdrop of imperial power in general. After 1991, this went into overdrive. It went into overdrive with the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of the so-called neoconservatives who said, now it's a unipolar world. Now we really can do what we want. We can overthrow governments right and left, and nobody can stop us. And this group actually aligns very strongly with the Israeli right, And so the neocons and the Israel lobby are hand in hand, and it makes it a little bit hard to distinguish the two different tracks, as you pointed out. Is this a U.S. imperial